Everyone in the quiet suburban town of Lakewood, Ohio, believed it was a fairy tale, a modern romance born from the internet, a woman finding love online. It began like countless connections forged in the digital ether, profiles exchanged, messages sent, a cautious exploration of shared interests and mutual compatibility across distance. Sarah, a graphic designer in her early 30s, navigated the landscape of online dating with a mixture of hope and cynicism, searching for a genuine connection after years of relationships that had failed to deepen. She lived a quiet life in a small bungalow near Lake Erie, her days structured around work, her evenings often spent with books or quiet hobbies, punctuated by occasional dinners with friends. Her profile spoke of a love for hiking, old films, and a desire for a partner who valued honesty and kindness. She had specific parameters, seeking someone local or within a reasonable driving distance, hoping to avoid the logistical complexities of long-distance romance. Then his message arrived. He used the name David Miller, his profile picture showing a man with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard, appearing to be in his late 50s or early 60s. He claimed to be recently relocated to a nearby town, a widower seeking companionship. His messages were articulate, thoughtful, and surprisingly personal, quickly moving beyond superficial pleasantries. He seemed genuinely interested in her life, her work, her thoughts on everything from local politics to favorite hiking trails. He possessed a quiet charm that felt both familiar and comforting, like speaking to someone she had known for years. Despite never having met him, they spent weeks exchanging lengthy emails and messages, building a rapport based on shared values and a surprisingly similar worldview. The digital connection deepened into a palpable anticipation, a sense that this might be different. His stories of his past were vague but plausible. He spoke of a career that had taken him to different parts of the country, a loving marriage cut short by tragedy, a quiet retirement that left him feeling a need for connection. He did not have children, he stated simply, a detail that seemed unremarkable at the time. He asked about her life, including her family history. Sarah was open about her background. She had been raised by her mother after her parents separated when she was an infant. Her father had left and she had no contact with him, possessing only fragmented information about his identity and whereabouts. She had made peace with his absence long ago, or so she believed, focusing on the present and the future. As the online courtship progressed, David was consistently available, responsive, and seemingly eager to learn everything about her. His virtual presence was a constant, reassuring force in her life. They talked about meeting, but he initially seemed hesitant, offering polite excuses related to settling into his new home or unexpected minor commitments. This hesitation, while frustrating, also lent an air of authenticity. He wasn't rushing things, wasn't pushy. It felt measured, respectful. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to the man behind the messages, the depth of his perceived character, the quiet strength she sensed in his words. Friends noted a change in her demeanor, a lightness they hadn't seen in some time. She spoke of David with a hopeful glow, sharing anecdotes from their conversations, painting a picture of a kind, gentle man who understood her. The initial plan was a simple coffee meeting in a public place in downtown Lakewood. The date was set. Sarah felt a nervous flutter, the kind that comes with bridging the gap between the digital world and physical reality. She reread their message exchanges, looking for any red flags she might have missed, any inconsistencies. She found none. His story was cohesive, his personality consistent. He seemed on paper and through their extensive communication, like everything she had been searching for. Yet, a subtle, unnameable feeling lingered just beneath the surface of her excitement. A tiny whisper of caution that she attributed to typical first-date nerves. The day arrived, overcast and cool, typical of early spring in northern Ohio. She dressed carefully, feeling a sense of occasion. The cafe was bustling, the aroma of coffee filling the air. She scanned the faces, looking for the man from the profile picture. He was seated in a back corner booth, exactly as he had described. He stood when she approached, offering a warm smile that mirrored the kindness in his eyes online. He was slightly taller than she expected, his build a little more substantial, but the face was undeniably the same. The salt and pepper beard framed a strong jawline, and his eyes held that same gentle warmth. He introduced himself as David, his voice a low baritone, steady and calm. They settled into the booth, and the conversation flowed easily, just as it had online. He listened intently, asked insightful questions, and shared just enough about himself to keep the exchange balanced. There was a comfortable familiarity to him, an ease that disarmed her initial nervousness. It felt natural, like reconnecting with a long-lost relative or friend. This inexplicable sense of connection, she thought, must be what people meant by immediate chemistry. It was a powerful feeling, overwhelming her previous subtle unease. Over coffee they talked for hours, covering topics they had discussed online, but with the added layer of physical presence, body language, and subtle cues. He seemed particularly interested in her childhood, asking about her mother, her schooling, the neighborhood she grew up in near the Rocky River Reservation. He listened with an intensity that felt flattering, almost studying her as she spoke. She recounted details about her mother's resilience, the challenges of being raised by a single parent, the vague stories she had heard about her father, a man who had left abruptly, whose name was rarely spoken. David nodded, his expression thoughtful, offering quiet observations about the complexities of family. He never spoke about his own deceased wife or his past life in much detail, focusing the conversation primarily on Sarah and her experiences. This, too, she rationalized as kindness, perhaps him not wanting to dwell on painful memories or simply being genuinely captivated by her story. As the afternoon wore on, the initial tentative meeting transformed into something more significant. The connection felt undeniable, a rare and precious find. He was charming, attentive, and seemed to understand her on a fundamental level. He paid for the coffee, walked her to her car, and held her gaze for a moment before they parted. "I'd like to see you again, Sarah," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Very much," she agreed without hesitation, a wide smile on her face. As she drove away, she felt a profound sense of optimism. This was it, she believed. This was the start of something real, something enduring. The subtle feeling of unease she had felt earlier was entirely forgotten, replaced by the exhilarating certainty of a new, promising relationship. She texted her best friend immediately, announcing that she had met him and that it felt wonderful, exciting. The digital romance had successfully transitioned into the real world, seemingly confirming the fairy tale narrative that was already beginning to form in her own mind, and the minds of those she shared the news with. Their relationship progressed quickly from that first meeting. David was consistent, reliable, and increasingly affectionate. They spent weekends together, exploring parks along the Ohio River, visiting small towns along the coast, enjoying quiet dinners at local restaurants in Lakewood and surrounding communities like Rocky River and Westlake. He fit seamlessly into her life, charming her friends with his quiet demeanor and thoughtful questions. He seemed genuinely interested in her world, her routines, the small details of her daily existence. His own past remained somewhat shrouded in a polite vagueness, but his presence in her present felt solid and real. He never introduced her to any family or friends of his own, explaining that his wife had passed away some years ago and he had limited remaining connections in the area, having only recently moved back after decades away. This explanation seemed reasonable, fitting the narrative of a man starting over. He became a fixture in her life. They grocery shopped together at the Giant Eagle on Detroit Avenue, attended community events, spent quiet evenings reading side by side. His age difference felt insignificant. He was active, engaged, and intellectually stimulating. He encouraged her in her work and listened patiently to her concerns. He was in many ways the steady, supportive partner she had always longed for. Friends commented on how happy she seemed, how David had brought a new sense of peace and stability into her life. Her mother, initially cautious about the online connection, met David and was also charmed by his quiet politeness and apparent devotion to her daughter. He spoke respectfully to her mother, showing interest in her life as well, solidifying his place within Sarah's small but close-knit circle. The narrative of the online fairy tale was becoming increasingly convincing, not just to others but to Sarah herself. Just under a year after their first meeting, David proposed. He did so simply during a quiet dinner at home, presenting her with a beautiful antique ring he claimed had belonged to his grandmother. Sarah was overjoyed. She said yes without hesitation, tears welling in her eyes. She felt a profound sense of gratitude and happiness. She was building a life with a man she loved, a man who seemed to love her completely, who offered the stability and partnership she desired. The wedding planning began almost immediately. They decided on a small, intimate ceremony at a historic church in downtown Cleveland, followed by a reception at a lakeside venue in Rocky River. The guest list was limited to close family and friends, emphasizing the personal nature of their bond. Sarah immersed herself in the details, choosing flowers, tasting cakes, selecting her dress. David was supportive and involved, though he deferred to her preferences on most things, expressing only his happiness to be marrying her. During the planning process, small, almost imperceptible inconsistencies would occasionally surface. A fleeting reference he made to a place name that didn't fit his purported history. A momentary lapse in recounting a past event. A quick change of subject when a specific detail about his life before he met her was probed. These were so minor, so quickly smoothed over, that Sarah barely registered them. She attributed them to age, or perhaps the understandable human tendency to sometimes mix up details. The overwhelming reality of their seemingly strong relationship, the joy of planning their future together, eclipsed any faint signals of discrepancy. She was happy, deeply in love, and looking forward to her wedding day. The narrative she had built around David, the kind widower, the devoted partner, the man she met online and was destined to be with, was robust, reinforced by the approval of those around her, and her own intense emotional investment. The wedding day arrived, bright and clear. The small church was filled with light, the air thick with the scent of flowers. Sarah walked down the aisle towards David, her heart full. They exchanged vows, promising forever. The ceremony was beautiful, the reception joyous. Friends and family celebrated the happy couple, raising toasts to their future. Everyone saw a woman who had found her perfect match, a testament to love's ability to find a way, even through the vastness of the internet. The illusion was complete, seamlessly woven into the fabric of their lives and the community's perception. Life after the wedding settled into a comfortable routine. They lived together in Sarah's bungalow in Lakewood, modifying it slightly to accommodate David. His presence was a constant, quiet anchor. He spent his days pursuing hobbies, while Sarah continued her work. They were, on the surface, a perfectly normal, happy couple navigating the early stages of married life. They had joint bank accounts, shared household responsibilities, and discussed future plans, perhaps traveling, or eventually buying a larger home together. The minor inconsistencies Sarah had noticed before the wedding seemed to disappear, or perhaps she had simply stopped looking for them, content in the stability of their marriage. The initial rush of romance evolved into a quieter, deeper companionship. David remained attentive, if sometimes reserved, his focus seemingly entirely on Sarah and their shared life. The first crack in the carefully constructed facade appeared subtly, innocuous. Sarah was going through old boxes stored in her mother's attic, helping her downsize. Among the forgotten mementos and dusty photographs, she found a small collection of pictures from her mother's early marriage to her biological father. The images were few, offering only glimpses. A young couple laughing, a snapshot of a man holding a swaddled infant. Sarah, a blurry photo taken from a distance. Her father was largely a blank in her memory, a figure from her mother's past that she had rarely discussed. She paused, looking at the man in the photo. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair and no beard. There was no immediate striking resemblance to David. People change significantly over 30 years, she reasoned. Yet, something about the set of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, tugged faintly at her memory. It was a resemblance that felt less about physical features, and more about an intangible quality, a certain expression or posture. She showed the photos to her mother later that week. Her mother looked at them with a bittersweet expression, a mix of sadness and resignation. She spoke briefly about the man in the pictures, recounting fragmented memories of their brief marriage and his sudden departure. She mentioned his first name, Robert, a name that was unfamiliar to Sarah. She spoke of his background, his work, the circumstances that led to their separation. As her mother spoke, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. Some of the details her mother shared about Robert's life, his interests, his travels, resonated with vague memories of things David had mentioned, though often presented differently, in a different context, or subtly altered. It was like hearing variations on a theme. She dismissed it as coincidence. Many people shared similar interests, or passed through the same places, but the feeling of unease persisted, a small stone dropping into the quiet pool of her contentment, sending out faint ripples. Over the next few days, the images of the man in the old photographs stayed with her. She found herself comparing his features, his build, his smile, to David's. The resemblance, initially subtle, began to appear stronger in her mind's eye. particularly around the eyes and the structure of his hands. She studied David more closely, noticing details she hadn't paid attention to before. His posture, his mannerisms, certain turns of phrase he used. She began to cross-reference things her mother had said about Robert with things David had shared about his past, looking for overlaps or contradictions. The more she looked, the more unsettling connections emerged. Details about locations he had lived, specific skills he possessed, stories about his family history. They sometimes mirrored, sometimes subtly deviated from what her mother had described about her father. It felt like two separate narratives that occasionally intersected in uncanny ways. The discomfort grew into a nagging suspicion, a cold dread that settled deep in her stomach. What if the resemblance wasn't a coincidence? What if the resemblance wasn't a coincidence? What if the vague unease she had initially felt about David, the slight inconsistencies, the lack of detail about his past, were not innocent? The thought was terrifying, bordering on the unthinkable. She pushed it away, telling herself she was being paranoid, letting old photographs and her mother's fragmented memories fuel an absurd fantasy. David was her husband, the kind man she had built a life with. The idea that he could be anyone other than who he claimed was preposterous, a betrayal of everything their relationship stood for. Yet, the seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to grow, feeding on the subtle discrepancies she had previously ignored or rationalized away. The sense of comfort and stability she had found in her marriage began to feel fragile, threatened by an invisible force. The turning point came unexpectedly, driven by an impulse she couldn't fully explain. Searching online for information about her biological father felt like stepping into forbidden territory, but the nagging suspicion compelled her. She had his first name, Robert, and her mother's maiden name, along with a rough time period and location from her parents' early life. Using online public records databases and search engines, she began to dig. Information was sparse at first, fragmented and difficult to verify. She found mentions of a man named Robert with a similar last name and age range, who had lived in the geographical area her mother mentioned during that time. The details were generic: residential addresses, potential past employers, nothing that immediately screamed biological father. But then, a professional online profile surfaced for a man with that name. It listed a career path and a set of skills that perfectly matched details her mother had mentioned about her father's profession decades ago. It also listed a location he had lived in, one that David had coincidentally mentioned as a place he had worked briefly years ago. The coincidences were accumulating, becoming harder to dismiss. The profile image was an older picture, perhaps 10 or 15 years old, but it showed a man without a beard, his hair starting to gray. Looking closely at this image, the resemblance to her wedding photos of David became undeniable, stark, and terrifying. The eyes, the bone structure, the faint lines around the mouth, they were the same. The man in the online profile, purportedly her father, bore a striking resemblance to her husband, David Miller. A wave of nausea washed over her. It couldn't be true. It was impossible. Yet, the visual evidence coupled with the accumulating circumstantial details painted a chilling picture. The profile provided a last known city for Robert. She cross-referenced this with addresses associated with David Miller. There was an overlap, a period when both names appeared to be linked to the same metropolitan area, albeit years apart according to the information available online. The most damning evidence arrived a few days later, almost accidentally. One evening while David was out, Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to search his personal belongings. It felt like a violation, a betrayal of trust, but the suspicion gnawing at her was unbearable. She found his wallet. Inside, alongside his driver's license and credit cards issued under the name David Miller, she found an old, laminated card tucked into a hidden pocket. It was an expired work ID badge. The name on the badge was Robert, her mother's maiden name's husband's last name. The photograph on the badge, though faded, was clearly of a younger man, the same man from her mother's old photos and the online profile. His true last name, her biological father's last name, the name she shared. The blood drained from her face. It was not a coincidence. It was not a resemblance. It was the same man. David Miller was an alias. The man she had met online, fallen in love with, and married was her biological father, living under a false identity. The shock was immediate and profound, a physical blow. Her carefully constructed reality shattered into a million pieces. The comfortable home felt alien, tainted by the immense deception it contained. She stumbled back, the ID badge falling from her trembling hand. The air felt thick, suffocating. Every shared memory, every intimate moment, every promise exchanged, was instantly recontextualized through this horrifying lens. The conversations where he had asked about her father, listening with such intense interest. It hadn't been curiosity, it had been a calculated gathering of information, a confirmation of her identity. His vague stories, his lack of personal history shared, the absence of his own family, all part of the elaborate disguise. He hadn't just been a man looking for love online. He had been her father, seeking out his own daughter for reasons she couldn't begin to comprehend. The realization brought with it a wave of revulsion. She looked at the wedding photo on the mantelpiece, the smiling couple. It was grotesque, a monument to an unspeakable lie. The man in the photo, her husband, was also the man who had abandoned her and her mother decades ago. Why? Why would he do this? Why hide his identity? Why seek her out in this way? The questions screamed in her mind, finding no answers in the silent house. The meticulous detail he had put into creating his David Miller persona, the sustained deception over months, the ultimate act of marrying his own daughter under false pretenses. It spoke of a level of calculation and manipulation that was deeply disturbing. It wasn't just a lie. It was a profound violation of trust and identity, a psychological horror. She had shared her life, her intimacy, her deepest vulnerabilities with a man who knew exactly who she was, while she remained ignorant of his true identity and their biological link. She sat in stunned silence as the full weight of the revelation settled upon her. The man she had married was her father. The man she had loved was her father. The physical intimacy they had shared, the thought was sickening, unbearable. It added a layer of trauma that went beyond mere deception, venturing into territory that felt inherently wrong, almost taboo, regardless of intent. His intent remained a terrifying unknown. What did he want? Why this elaborate charade? The possibilities were endless, and all of them seemed sinister. Was it some twisted form of regret? An attempt to reconnect in a way he couldn't manage honestly? Was it something darker, more predatory? She didn't know, and the not knowing was agonizing. She felt exposed, vulnerable, utterly alone in the face of this monstrous secret. The quiet suburban house, once a sanctuary of her happiness, now felt like a prison of deceit. She knew, with chilling certainty, that she could not confront him. Not yet. The shock was too great, the implications too vast. She needed time to process, to understand the scope of what had happened. She carefully placed the expired ID badge back where she found it, ensuring everything looked undisturbed. She wiped away any traces of her search. She had to appear normal, maintain the facade, while her inner world crumbled. This was a different kind of investigation now. A desperate search for answers that had begun in the dusty archives of her mother's past, and led to the terrifying secret hidden within her own marriage. She needed proof, irrefutable evidence that would stand up to scrutiny, not just an old ID badge and a gut feeling. She needed definitive confirmation of his identity. The first step, she realized, was to get a DNA test. It was the only way to confirm the biological link beyond any doubt. But how to obtain a sample discreetly? The thought of taking something of his, a hair, a used glass, felt clandestine and wrong. But the situation was beyond normal boundaries. She needed to act methodically, carefully, because she instinctively understood the danger she might be in. If he was capable of such a prolonged and profound deception, what else was he capable of? The man she thought she knew, the kind, gentle David, was a fiction. The reality, Robert, her father, was an unknown entity, his true character and motives obscured by years of lies. The quiet life she had built, the seemingly stable marriage, was a house built on sand, and it had just collapsed. She retrieved the expired ID badge once more, studying the photograph and the name. Robert, her mother's maiden name's husband's last name. The name felt foreign, yet it was half of her own identity. She took photos of the badge with her phone, saving them securely. She also carefully noted the date of expiration on the card, a detail that might be relevant later. This small laminated piece of plastic was the key, the physical embodiment of the lie she had married. She replaced it, her hands still shaking. She had to maintain her composure. She had to act normal until she could confirm the truth and figure out what to do next. The hours stretched into an eternity, the quiet ticking of the clock amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. Every sound outside, every creak of the house, felt like a potential threat. She was married to a stranger, a man who was simultaneously her husband and her father, a man whose motives were entirely unknown. The reality was almost too bizarre to comprehend. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The life she had known was over. The DNA test kit sat on the kitchen counter for 2 days, unopened. Its presence was a silent accusation, a stark reminder of the terrifying secret that had invaded her life. Sarah moved through her days in a daze, performing the necessary tasks of daily life, going to work, making dinner, conversing with David, while her mind reeled with the implications of her discovery. She watched him closely, searching his face for any sign that he knew she suspected, any flicker of recognition, any hint of the man named Robert she had seen in the photos. His demeanor remained unchanged. He was the same quiet, attentive. This unnerving consistency in his false persona only deepened her sense of dread. It spoke of a level of self-control and sustained deception that was chilling. How long had he planned this? Since her profile first appeared online. Had he specifically sought her out? Obtaining a DNA sample without his knowledge proved difficult. She considered obvious methods. A hair from his brush, a discarded tissue, a toothbrush. But worried about detection, he was observant, and any deviation from her normal behavior might alert him. She needed something less traceable, something that would be collected naturally. She decided to collect a sample from an object he frequently used and likely wouldn't notice being briefly absent or tampered with. His water bottle, left by his bedside, seemed the best option. One morning, while he was in the shower, she quickly took the bottle, poured a small amount of residual water into a clean container, and returned the bottle. It felt invasive and wrong, a violation of the privacy she was supposed to share with her husband. But the need for truth overshadowed the discomfort. She packaged the water sample according to the DNA kit instructions, filled out the necessary forms using an assumed name for the second party, to avoid any potential database flags associated with her father's real name, and mailed it. The waiting began. The days stretched into weeks. The tension in the house, though invisible to David, was palpable to Sarah. Every conversation felt like navigating a minefield. He would ask about her day, and she would answer, all the while thinking, "You are my father. You married me under a false name." The psychological burden was immense. She withdrew slightly, explaining it away as stress from work. David seemed concerned, offering quiet support, which only twisted the knife further. His kindness felt like another layer of the lie. She confided in no one, not even her closest friend or her mother. The secret felt too enormous, too grotesque, to share. How could she explain this? How could she tell them that the man they welcomed into their lives, celebrated with, was not only a fraud, but held a terrifying biological connection to her? She feared they would think she was insane. Or worse, that they would be drawn into the orbit of his deception and potential danger. During this agonizing wait, she continued her quiet investigation. She revisited the online profile for Robert, her father's real last name, cross-referencing every piece of information with what she knew about David Miller. She found old newspaper articles mentioning a person with that name in various locations over the years. Some details aligned perfectly with vague stories David had told. Others contradicted his narrative entirely. It became clear he had woven elements of his true past into the David Miller persona, blending fact and fiction to create a convincing but ultimately false identity. She searched for his name in public records databases related to family history, but found little conclusive information beyond what she already suspected. The key piece was the DNA confirmation. Until then, it was all hypothesis, however strongly supported by circumstantial evidence. Approximately 3 weeks after mailing the sample, the email arrived. The subject line was generic: DNA test results available. Her hands trembled as she clicked the link. She had paid for the most comprehensive test, one that included a relationship prediction. She logged into the portal. The results were displayed clearly, clinically. Predicted relationship, parent, child. There was also a list of genetic matches. The top match was listed simply as subject 2, the placeholder name she had used for David's sample. The confidence level for the parent-child relationship was 99%. There was no room for doubt. It was definitive. Subject 2 was her biological parent, and Subject 2 was the man she had married. The confirmation was devastating. It hit her with a force that stole her breath. She wasn't paranoid. She wasn't imagining things. The man she slept beside, ate with, built a life with, was her biological father. The implications were staggering, grotesque. The marriage was a lie, a perversion. Her identity, her past, her future, were all irrevocably tainted by this monstrous deception. The emotional restraint she had maintained for weeks shattered. Tears streamed down her face, silent and uncontrollable. She was married to her father. The words echoed in her mind. A horrifying refrain. The sheer scale of his deception, the psychological manipulation involved in seeking out his own daughter and marrying her under a false identity, was almost too much to bear. She sat at her computer, the clinical report staring back at her, confirming the darkest of her suspicion. The physical evidence was now undeniable. Robert, her father's real last name, the man who had abandoned her as an infant, had re-entered her life decades later, not as a father seeking reconciliation, but as a suitor, a husband, under the assumed identity of David Miller. The motive remained shrouded in darkness. Was it a twisted attempt at closeness? Was there something more sinister at play? The lack of clarity surrounding his intentions was terrifying. His ability to maintain this elaborate lie for so long, to interact with her and her family without a single flicker of recognition or guilt, at least, none that she had perceived, spoke of a deeply disturbed individual. The man she married was not just a deceiver. He was a man who had crossed a fundamental boundary, blurring the lines of identity and relationship in a way that felt fundamentally wrong. She looked around the quiet house, the house she shared with him. Every object, every room, seemed to carry the weight of his lie. The armchair where he read, the coffee mug he used that morning, the bed they shared. It was all tainted. She needed to leave. Immediately. She couldn't stay under the same roof as him now that she knew the truth. But she had to be strategic. She couldn't let him know she knew. Not yet. The element of surprise was her only potential advantage. She quietly began to make a plan. She would pack a small bag, just essentials, while he was out of the house. She would gather the evidence she had collected, the photographs of the ID badge, the DNA report, printed and saved digitally, any notes she had taken during her research. She would contact a lawyer and the police. This wasn't just a case of identity theft or marital fraud. It involved a disturbing biological relationship that had been deliberately concealed. The legal ramifications were complex, likely involving annulment and potentially criminal charges depending on his motive and end. The emotional toll was immense. Grief for the lost relationship mingled with disgust and fear. She mourned the man she thought she had married, the future she believed they would share. But that man, David, had never truly existed. He was a construct, a disguise worn by a man who was biologically her father. The violation felt total, emotional, psychological, and physical. She felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just by him but by the very concept of identity and trust. How could she ever trust anyone again? How could she reconcile the image of the kind, gentle husband with the reality of the deceptive biological father? The two simply could not coexist. One was a lie, expertly crafted and terrifyingly maintained. That evening, when David returned home, Sarah acted as normally as she could, forcing a smile, engaging in superficial conversation. Every moment in his presence felt like a performance, a desperate attempt to conceal the seismic shift that had occurred within her. He seemed oblivious, discussing his day with his usual quiet demeanor. The contrast between his apparent normalcy and the earth-shattering truth she possessed was surreal, nightmare. She felt a growing sense of urgency. She couldn't maintain this charade for long. She had to get out. She needed to be somewhere safe before she confronted him or involved law enforcement. She decided she would leave the next morning, telling him she needed to visit her mother or a friend. She would go directly to a lawyer's office, then the police station, presenting the evidence and the horrifying truth. The night was a long, agonizing vigil, spent lying awake beside the man who was both her husband and her father, the silence of the bedroom amplifying the deafening roar of her thoughts and fears. The following morning, Sarah rose early, her resolve hardening. She told David she was going to her mother's for the day to help her with something. He accepted this without question, giving her a kiss goodbye. The touch of his lips on her cheek, knowing what she now knew, sent a shiver of revulsion through her. She drove away from the house, not towards her mother's but towards the city center. towards a lawyer's office she had researched online the previous night. The small bag containing her evidence sat on the passenger seat, a heavy weight. As she drove through the familiar streets of Lakewood, past the tree-lined avenues and older homes, the sense of normalcy around her felt like a cruel mockery of the chaos inside. Her world had imploded, while the world outside continued on, unaware of the grotesque secret that had been hidden in plain sight within one of its quiet suburban homes. At the lawyer's office in downtown Cleveland, Sarah recounted her story, presenting the photos of the ID badge and the DNA test results. The lawyer, initially skeptical, grew visibly disturbed as she laid out the evidence and the timeline. The implications of her narrative, identity theft, marriage fraud, and the deeply disturbing biological relationship, were unprecedented and complex. The lawyer confirmed that based on the evidence, her marriage was almost certainly invalid, due to the profound deception and lack of informed consent regarding his identity and their relationship. He advised her to immediately report the matter to the police. The legal aspects were significant, but the human element, the sheer horror of the situation, overshadowed the procedural concerns. The lawyer recommended she prioritize her safety, as the man's motives remained unknown and potentially dangerous given the level of his deception. Leaving the lawyer's office, Sarah went directly to the Cleveland Division of Police headquarters. She was met with a mixture of disbelief and gravity as she calmly presented her case to the detectives. She provided the evidence, recounted the story of meeting David online, the progression of their relationship, the wedding, her growing suspicion, her investigation, the discovery of the ID badge, and the confirmation from the DNA test. She explained that the man she married, David Miller, was actually Robert, her father's real last name, her biological father. The detectives listened intently, the initial skepticism replaced by a grim understanding of the unprecedented nature of the situation. This was not a typical fraud case. It involved a violation of familial bounds and a profound act of psychological manipulation on a grand scale. Law enforcement initiated an immediate investigation. They cross-referenced the name Robert, her father's real last name, with various databases, confirming his existence and past. They found records that corroborated elements of the history Sarah's mother had shared, and which David had subtly incorporated into his alias. They also began to build a profile of David Miller, quickly discovering that this identity appeared to be relatively recent, lacking the long history one would expect from someone his purported age. The evidence strongly suggested David Miller was indeed a fabricated identity, carefully constructed by Robert. Detectives expressed concern for Sarah's safety and advised her not to return to the house. She stayed with her mother, who was devastated and in shock upon hearing the truth. Investigators focused on understanding Robert's movements and actions leading up to and during his relationship with Sarah. They reviewed online activity associated with both the David Miller persona and, where possible, information linked to Robert, her father's real last name. They sought to determine when and how he might have become aware of Sarah's existence and her presence on online dating platforms. Initial findings suggested he had been researching her online for some time before making contact, indicating a deliberate, calculated plan rather than a chance encounter. This element of premeditation added a disturbing layer to the case. His motive remained the central, unanswered question. What prompted a father to seek out his estranged adult daughter and marry her under a false identity? Law enforcement began the process of locating Robert. They discovered he had not returned to the Lakewood house after Sarah left that morning. His car was gone. Investigators searched the residence, meticulously documenting the scene. The house, just days before a symbol of marital happiness, was now a crime scene, marked by yellow tape around the property. Inside, they found further evidence supporting Sarah's account, documents related to the David Miller identity, some of which showed signs of being recently created or acquired, and other items that potentially linked back to Robert, her father's real last name. The undisturbed breakfast table from that morning sat in the kitchen, a poignant image of shattered normalcy. The investigation expanded, reaching out to individuals who knew Robert from his past life, before he became David Miller. Obtaining information was challenging. Decades had passed, and his life appeared to have been somewhat transient at times. However, through interviews and records, investigators began to piece together a fragmented picture of the man. There were mentions of a history of unstable relationships, financial difficulties at various points, and a tendency towards isolation. Some individuals described him as quiet and intense, others as charming but elusive. No clear singular motive emerged immediately from these initial inquiries. The psychological aspect of the case was immense. What level of detachment or delusion would allow a father to perpetrate such a deception against his own child? Investigators also examined Robert's financial activity. They found that while living as David Miller, he had managed his finances carefully, maintaining a seemingly legitimate if modest lifestyle. There was no immediate evidence of significant financial gain from his relationship with Sarah, which, while not ruling out financial motive entirely, suggested other factors might be primary. The focus shifted increasingly towards the psychological dimensions of his actions. Experts consulted on the case struggled to find parallels for such a specific and elaborate form of familial deception involving marriage. It went beyond typical cases of fraud or estranged parent issue. The act of marrying his own daughter, regardless of whether the act was legally recognized or physically consummated, a detail not relevant to the core deception, was a profound and disturbing boundary violation that spoke of deep-seated psychological issue. The investigation continued to build the profile of Robert, her father's real last name, seeking any clues that might shed light on his motivations and current whereabouts. The community of Lakewood reeled from the news as details began to surface, struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet, seemingly normal couple with the horrific truth hidden beneath the surface. The fairy tale had become a nightmare, casting a long shadow over the familiar streets and shared lives. As the investigation into Robert, her father's real last name's past deepened, a more complex picture began to emerge, hinting at potential motives behind his actions. While no single clear explanation surfaced immediately, investigators uncovered details suggesting a history of emotional instability and a pattern of seeking control in relationships. There were vague reports from former acquaintances about a fixation on his past and a sense of unresolved issues, particularly related to his early family life and the separation from Sarah's mother. Some witnesses described him as a man who harbored deep regrets, but seemed incapable of addressing them directly or honestly. This incapacity for authentic connection, coupled with a potential need to exert a distorted form of influence or control, became a leading psychological theory. Detectives also explored the timeline meticulously. Forensic examination of his computer and online accounts, even those under the David Miller alias, revealed extensive search history related to Sarah's whereabouts, her profession, and her online presence long before he initiated contact. This confirmed the deliberate and premeditated nature of his approach. He hadn't simply stumbled upon her profile, he had actively sought her out. This negated the possibility of a chance encounter and solidified the understanding that the online romance was a carefully orchestrated plan from the beginning. The specific platform where he met Sarah was also analyzed, but it appeared to be simply the chosen vehicle for his predetermined course of action, not the instigator. The psychological layer of the investigation posited that his motive might have been a twisted attempt at paternal connection, born from guilt, regret, or a desire to reinsert himself into her life in a way that bypassed the complexities of acknowledging his past failures or the decades of absence. By creating a new identity, he could interact with her without the baggage of being the father who left, observing her life, becoming close to her, potentially even feeling a sense of making up for his absence on his own terms built entirely on deceit. The act of marriage, in this context, could be seen as the ultimate, perverse expression of this desire for closeness and control, a way to bind her to him legally and emotionally under his fabricated identity. It was a horrifyingly narcissistic approach, prioritizing his own needs and a distorted sense of connection over Sarah's well-being and right to the truth. Legal professionals consulted on the case confirmed the extreme nature of the situation. While specific statutes regarding marrying a biological relative under a false identity might be complex or unprecedented, charges related to identity theft, fraud, and potentially more serious offenses depending on the full scope of his actions and intent, were applicable. The marriage itself was unequivocally invalid, a nullity from its inception due to the fundamental fraud regarding his identity and relationship to Sarah. The legal process would focus on dissolving the fraudulent union and addressing the criminal aspects of his deception. For Sarah, the legal proceedings would be a necessary but painful step in dismantling the facade and seeking some form of justice and closure, though true closure for such a profound violation was unlikely. Witness statements from those who knew David Miller during his time with Sarah painted a consistent picture of a quiet, somewhat reserved man who seemed devoted to his new wife. Neighbors in Lakewood described him as polite and unassuming. Co-workers of Sarah who had met him socially found him pleasant, if a little private. These accounts underscored the effectiveness of his disguise and the depth of his commitment to the false persona. He had successfully integrated himself into Sarah's life and community without arousing significant suspicion, a testament to his careful planning and sustained effort. It also highlighted the profound shock experienced by everyone who knew the couple when the truth emerged. The man they saw, the relationship they witnessed, was a complete fabrication. Investigators continued their search for Robert, her father's real last name. His disappearance from the Lakewood house following Sarah's revelation indicated he likely knew she had discovered the truth and fled to avoid apprehension. The search expanded beyond Ohio, based on his past travel and residency patterns. Information from his earlier life provided leads, but he had decades to build new connections and potential safe havens. The urgency to locate him was heightened not only by the need for legal accountability, but also by the desire to understand his full motive and ensure he could not repeat such an act or pose a further threat. His ability to live a double life, to construct and maintain a false identity while intimately involved with his own daughter, marked him as an individual capable of extreme psychological manipulation. The emotional impact on Sarah was immense and ongoing. The initial shock gave way to a deep, complex trauma. She struggled to reconcile the man she loved with the father who had perpetrated this elaborate, horrifying lie. The betrayal was absolute. Every memory, every shared experience, was now viewed through a lens of deceit. The physical intimacy of their marriage was a particularly difficult aspect to process, adding a layer of revulsion and trauma that went beyond the intellectual understanding of the fraud. Therapy became a necessary step in navigating the immense psychological landscape of her experience. Her relationship with her mother, while supportive, was also complicated by the shared history with Robert. The man who had caused pain and absence in both their lives had returned decades later to inflict a new, unprecedented form of harm. The narrative structure of the investigation mirrored the dismantling of Robert's false identity. Each piece of evidence, each witness statement, each forensic finding chipped away at the David Miller facade, revealing the disturbing reality beneath. The process was meticulous, requiring patience and attention to detail, much like his own careful construction of the lie. The case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the potential dangers hidden within the anonymity of the internet and the capacity for human deception. It underscored how even seemingly normal, loving relationships could be built on foundations of profound lies with devastating consequences. The search for Robert, her father's real last name, continued, a crucial step towards bringing a degree of resolution to a case that had shattered lives and exposed a horrifying truth hidden in plain sight. The search for Robert, her father's real last name, continued for several weeks following his disappearance from Lakewood. Law enforcement pursued leads based on his known associates, past residences, and financial activity linked to both his true identity and the David Miller alias, before it was abandoned. The investigation extended across multiple states where he had previously lived or traveled. They found evidence of his transient nature in the years prior to meeting Sarah, suggesting he had been difficult to track even before he adopted the alias. His ability to disappear effectively after Sarah's discovery highlighted the careful planning that likely underpinned his entire scheme. Detectives interviewed more individuals from Robert's earlier life, attempting to gain deeper insight into his character and potential motivations. Some described a man who struggled with relationships, who held grudges, and who had a tendency towards controlling behavior. There were mentions of past conflicts, though nothing that specifically pointed towards the extreme actions he would later undertake. The psychological profile continued to suggest a deeply troubled individual, likely suffering from personality disorders that enabled his capacity for sustained deception and his distorted view of familial connection and boundaries. The motive remained multifaceted, likely a confluence of unresolved past issues, guilt, regret, a need for control, and a perverse desire for connection on his own terms. Investigators also revisited the initial online connection. They analyzed the specific dating platform and Robert's activity on it. While the platform itself was not implicated in any wrongdoing, it was the stage where his deception began. His initial messages to Sarah were re-examined, read now not as hopeful overtures from a potential partner, but as calculated probes from a father testing the waters with his unsuspecting daughter. His questions about her family, her background, her mother, took on a chilling significance, revealing his intent to gather information and confirm her identity before proceeding with his plan. The digital breadcrumbs he left, seemingly innocuous at the time, now formed a trail of deliberate deception. Sarah's experience became a focal point of the investigation, her testimony providing the human anchor to the procedural details. She worked with law enforcement, recalling every detail of her relationship with David, searching for anything that might provide clues to his mindset or whereabouts. The process was emotionally draining, forcing her to relive the trauma of the deception and the violation. Yet, she remained resolute in her desire for the truth to be fully exposed and for Robert to be held accountable. Her strength in the face of such a devastating betrayal was noted by the investigators. The legal process began to move forward. Although its path was complicated by Robert's fugitive status, the state of Ohio initiated steps to have the fraudulent marriage annulled based on the grounds of fraud and the undisclosed biological relationship. This legal process was relatively straightforward, as the evidence of deception was overwhelming. However, the criminal case against Robert depended on his apprehension. Charges related to identity theft and fraud were being prepared, with the possibility of additional charges depending on the findings of the ongoing investigation into his motive and actions. The media coverage of the case, once details began to emerge, was intense. The story of a woman who unknowingly married her biological father met online, captured public attention due to its bizarre and disturbing nature. Sarah remained largely out of the public eye, focusing on her recovery and cooperation with the investigation. The community of Lakewood struggled to process the reality of the situation, the quiet suburban life disrupted by a real-life psychological thriller that had unfolded in their midst. The trust that underpinned social interactions was shaken, a reminder that appearances could be deeply deceiving. Several weeks after Robert's disappearance, a break in the case occurred hundreds of miles away. A routine traffic stop in a small town in a different state flagged the license plate of a vehicle matching the description of Robert's car. The driver matched Robert's physical description, albeit with changes in appearance intended to further obscure his identity. He was apprehended without incident. The man identified himself as David Miller, but fingerprints and other identifying markers confirmed he was indeed Robert, her father's real last name. He was taken into custody and held for extradition back to Ohio to face charges. His apprehension brought a sense of relief to Sarah and the investigators, a crucial step towards accountability and understanding. With Robert in custody, the focus of the investigation shifted to interviewing him and gathering direct information about his motive and the extent of his planning. However, Robert remained largely uncooperative, offering evasive answers or maintaining a stony silence. His demeanor in custody was consistent with the controlled, emotionally detached individual described by some who knew him, and evidenced by his ability to maintain the David Miller persona for so long. His refusal to provide a clear explanation for his actions only deepened the mystery and the horror of the case. The most compelling evidence of his motive remained the meticulous planning revealed by the digital forensics and witness accounts, pointing towards a premeditated and psychologically complex form of control and manipulation. The legal proceedings against Robert, her father's real last name, began. The charges included identity theft, fraud, and potentially other related offenses depending on the final findings of the investigation. The fraudulent marriage to Sarah was formally annulled. The court proceedings, while clinical and procedural in nature, underscored the devastating human impact of Robert's actions. Sarah's ordeal was central to the case, highlighting the profound violation she had experienced. The legal process aimed to hold Robert accountable for his criminal behavior, but it could not undo the emotional and psychological damage inflicted. The court sought to understand his actions, but his continued lack of genuine explanation left a void, a chilling testament to the depth of his detachment or delusion. Testimony and evidence presented in court detailed the timeline of Robert's deception, from his initial online research of Sarah to his creation of the David Miller identity, the online courtship, the physical relationship, and the marriage. The DNA evidence confirming the parent-child relationship was presented, a stark and irrefutable fact that underscored the unnatural nature of the union. Psychological experts provided assessments, attempting to explain the mindset that could lead a father to commit such an act against his own daughter. They spoke of severe personality disturbances, including narcissistic traits, and a profound inability to form healthy, authentic relationships. The case drew significant attention, not only for its sensational details but for the complex psychological and ethical questions it raised. The proceedings revealed further details about Robert's life leading up to the deception. There were indications of financial instability and a transient lifestyle, but nothing that fully explained the specific decision to target and marry his estranged daughter. The most plausible explanation, supported by the evidence of his deliberate planning and sustained deception, remained rooted in a complex interplay of psychological factors, unresolved issues from his past, a distorted sense of paternity, a need for control, and an inability to approach Sarah honestly. He sought a connection, but on terms entirely dictated by his own needs and pathology, regardless of the harm it would cause. The outcome of the legal case, while important for formal accountability, offered no true sense of closure for Sarah. Robert was found guilty of the charges against him. He received a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes, particularly the elements of fraud and the violation of trust involved. However, his conviction and imprisonment did not provide a satisfying answer to the fundamental question of why. His motives remained, to some extent, locked within his own disturbed mind, leaving Sarah and those affected to grapple with the incomprehensible nature of his actions. The man who was both her husband and her father remained an enigma, his true self obscured by years of lies and a seemingly impenetrable psychological barrier. Following the legal resolution, Sarah began the long and difficult process of rebuilding her life. The annulment meant her marriage to David Miller was legally erased, a necessary step in reclaiming her identity. However, the experience left deep scars. The violation of trust was profound, affecting her ability to form new relationships and feel safe in the world. The knowledge that her own father had perpetrated such a cruel and elaborate deception was a heavy burden to carry. She continued therapy, working through the layers of trauma. Her relationship with her mother deepened, bonded by the shared pain and the need to process the actions of the man who had impacted both their lives in devastating ways, decades apart. The community of Lakewood slowly moved forward, but the memory of the bizarre and disturbing events remained, a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. The house where Sarah and David had lived together eventually stood empty, a silent testament to the lie that had been exposed within its walls. The wedding photos were taken down, the symbols of the fraudulent union removed. Sarah's journey towards healing was long and arduous, a process of reclaiming her sense of self and finding a way to live with the knowledge of the unspeakable deception she had unknowingly married. The quiet devastation of the case served as a grim reminder that sometimes, the most horrifying truths are those hidden not by distance or anonymity alone, but by the deliberate and meticulous lies of those closest to us. The internet had been the tool, but the deception was born from a human darkness that defied easy explanation, leaving a haunting question mark over the concepts of identity, trust, and the complex, often painful bonds of family. The quiet streets of Lakewood held their secrets, but some secrets, once exposed, could never truly be forgotten.